Hello, and welcome to Leadership Trail Mix. I am Miguel Oliveira, and for the next few minutes, we'll be together looking at one of the many ingredients that compose this art and science we call people leadership. We have a guest today, Jonathan Santos Silva, who does some amazing work in the education space. And instead of trying to introduce him and capture some elements of his story, I thought I would just ask you, Jonathan, to introduce yourself and help us learn a little bit more about who you are and what brought you here. So, Jonathan Santos Silva, welcome to Leadership Trail Mix.
Thank you, Miguel. You already said my name, Jonathan Santos Silva. And as far as an introduction, I would say that, professionally, I've dedicated my career, especially these last 10 years or so, to education in rural and indigenous spaces. And that comes out of my work as a teacher first, a high school math teacher on the Pine Ridge Reservation in southwestern South Dakota. And there I learned so much about community and leadership, but with indigenous roots, right? About walking with people, loving people, caring about them, looking at them as your relatives, and learning how that changes the way you show up. When I'm not in a classroom or at a school coaching, working with leaders, I am probably, as I like to joke, driving the activity bus. My wife and I have 4 children. They are 10, 8, and 6. And so if we're not at a soccer field, we're at the dance studio and vice versa.
I love that. Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing, Jonathan. And I have so much appreciation for people who work in the education space. I feel like who I am today is so much related to the amazing teachers I've had in my life and to whom I'm so grateful. So I think the same way we talk about service for those who are out in the battlefield fighting wars, I want to say thank you for your service and thank you for the service of all the teachers listening to us today.
Thank you. Thank you. I agree. I think it's, what our men and women in uniform do for us is important. And I think what educators do every day, preparing, I think any country's greatest resource is its children. It's the future. And so I do think that teachers, frontline educators and principals and stuff, they have some of the most important work. And so I accept that for all my comrades in the education field. Thank you.
I love it. Absolutely. All right. So you recently posted something on LinkedIn, Jonathan, that I would love for us to unpack together. You said, every challenge is pointing towards a missing connection, a missing voice, a missing bridge. Can you explain or expand a little bit on that for us?
Sure. I am, I think, just by nature, kind of like a systems thinker. I didn't know that was a term always, but as I got older and was exposed to it, it just made sense, right? Like our whole world, is a system. When you think about what happened during COVID and when people were inside and we weren't driving our cars, we weren't flying, the way that the earth began to heal itself and recreate itself, it's a system, right? Just like our bodies are systems comprised of little mini systems, our cells. And so communities are systems. And when a community isn't working well for a certain person or a certain group of people, I look at that as there's something in the system is either broken or is poorly designed. And it introduces us to the opportunity to redesign or reimagine. And so we have many ways we could look at it, but I think the most common are either to blame the people because they're not getting what they need. And in schools, that looks like these kids don't care, their parents don't value education, there's no community value around education, things like that blame. Or we can look, something's missing. This kid, what is missing in this child's life that is not allowing him or her or them to engage? Or what is the barrier that is getting in the way of the family's ability to support, and so on and so forth. And I think that, within any system, when we orient that way, so it doesn't have to just be the kids or parents, it could actually be our staff as well. If a teacher is struggling, rather than jump immediately to there's something wrong with the teacher, it's what does he or she, or what do they need to be supported? What connection to a book, a resource, a coach? And I think when we operate that way, it goes back to like what I learned on the reservation about seeing people as relatives. If you care about this person, if you care about these folks, if you care about these families, these kids, then I think it orients you to solution finding as opposed to blaming, orienting around problems.
Absolutely. I love that. from blaming to finding solutions, right? And it's funny because it feels like a lot of the organizations in the world that achieve great results are the ones where that bond, that invisible bond, is recognized and nurtured. Like I remember hearing Simon Sinek saying that in the Navy they call each other brothers and sisters, and they really care and protect each other. And I feel like the concept is somewhat similar here, right?
Yeah. I mean, my father, he spent 39 years in the military. And, you know, well before the rest of the country had integrated, well before a lot of, we've addressed a lot of our social ills. Look at the different branches of our military and you see one of the few spaces where across, socioeconomics, maybe not the rich, because they can always find a deferment, but, the working class, the poor, Black, white, Latino, Native American, all these communities have rich traditions of service. And then and in the military, the various branches where you have this kind of shared value system, shared belief, and seeing the inherent value in one another. Like if you and I are in the same squad or in the same unit, I need you to live, right? And you need me to live so we can make it through this together. And I think if we as communities look at that, like we need not 75% or 85% or 95% of kids to succeed, but we want 100% of kids to succeed because we need them all. We need one of them is our future mayor. A few of them will work at the hospital. Some of them might be running the old folks home if we get sent there. We want them to be kind. We want them to be caring. We want them to be to share our values of togetherness and collective success. So I think it's just important.
It is. Thank you, Jonathan. I'm super looking forward to this next question, which is, I would say, double clicking on each element of your power framework, which I absolutely love. I'm a big fan of the design thinking principles. I've read a few books from the Stanford D School, and super impressed with how it just works. And I have to say, I don't think I've seen anyone explain the steps of design thinking in such a simple way as you do with your power acronym or your power framework. So if you could just kind of touch on each element of the power framework and help us understand what it is all about, that would be awesome.
Sure. And so I'm glad you mentioned the D School because I think of Stanford as one of the places that, not physically learn from, but through all the resources they have online. It was one of my earliest introductions to design thinking, or as folks who are listening, they may have heard it as human-centered design, or, many different terms. But the idea that we can no longer afford to design things without the people we're trying to serve, right? So to design a building or a room or a chair or anything without the people who are going to enter that door or who are going to use that chair is just foolish. It's a fool's errand. And so Stanford is at the forefront of that and making that really readily accessible. And so that is at the root of the power framework. And then the other side of it, I would say, is training that I received from the Industrial Areas Foundation on broad-based organizing. And with broad-based organizing, similarly, it's maybe the other side of the coin, at least the way I see it. It's that whereas we may normally think about power as positional authority, so the president or the executive director or the CEO has power, and I don't because I'm just a worker or whatever. Well, that's one form of power. And another one folks think about is money. Well, the rich people, they always have power. Okay, so you have organized money, you have positional authority, but you also have organized people, right? When we bring people together around issues they care about, there's power in that. Power is really the same root of the word power is the root of the Spanish word poder, which is to be able. So power is just in English, it's really just the ability to act. And as long as you have the ability to act, you have power. And so I borrowed that definition from my organizing training, and I tried to blend it with the idea of design thinking. So we're not just designing or redesigning, reimagining our spaces or our schools, but also at the same time, we're building the agency and the power and the voice of the people who are served. And so the P is about problem definition, or moving from problem to opportunity. And I put that first because I think it starts with, something that you're passionate about addressing. One of the folks who trained me in organizing talked about how his first organizing job, he really wanted to get these moms organized to transform their school. And then he was disappointed when they wanted to advocate for a new playground because he's like, playground, this is what we're doing. But in the long run, when he focused on what they wanted, that problem for them was they didn't have a safe place for their kids to play without shards of glass, without broken tar, and cracks and things of that nature. Once those moms saw the power that they had to create a safe place for their kids to learn and play, which they did
Yep.
eventually, then they turned to him and said, we want to tackle our school now. And so it starts with defining the problem, a problem that is not just important to me if I'm the leader or the organizer, but that is important to my community. So that's the P. The O is about observe and empathize. Again, if we're designing, we need to design with people, not for them, especially not for people who are not in the room. And so the observations and empathizing are about getting a deeper and more enduring understanding of how you experience the system. So if we're talking about schools and we're talking about the student experience, I need to interview students. If we're talking about our family engagement strategy, I want to get out of the school building and to a library, to a community center, to a place that my families frequent and talk to them. Tell me about a time when you felt really supported at school. Tell me about a time when you felt unheard. You know what I mean? I'm digging for stories and even the underlying emotions, about how they feel about those experiences. And as I do that, it's not just about, okay, now that I know how Miguel experiences this school, now I can do it for him. No, my perspective changes. But the second part that I think is so beneficial from like an organizing perspective is this might be the first time Miguel has felt heard in our system. And now that he's heard, he wants to stay involved, ideally. And so now the work is lighter because we're doing it together. We're walking alongside our relatives. The W is about widening our perspective. Once we've interviewed the people who experience this most acutely, I like to think about the folks who are like, we want to center the folks who are least well served in our system. Once we've spoken to them, once we've included them in our process, widening our perspective is about tapping into other forms of expertise that might improve the way we solve or approach to solve this issue. And so an example of that is when we were doing a virtual design camp for students during COVID. They were from different reservation communities across the country, and we had invited them to tackle the problem that we thought was really important, which was, how might we ensure that the schools you return to are places of radical belonging, right? How do we make sure every kid of all backgrounds, typically developing, neurodivergent, poor, rich, LGBT, every kid would feel that the school they go back to is a place they are welcome? Because that's not how every kid experiences it today. But we asked that question. And so they interviewed their peers, and then we invited actual principals, school leaders, tribal education leaders, elders, folks who had all kinds of other knowledge and had designed things to come to the table, and the kids interviewed them. And what ended up happening in that case was that one of the groups pivoted from our focus on schools and started designing for elders. Because again, during COVID, everybody's locked in. All these elders were isolated, and they realized if we're talking about radical belonging and everyone being included, we want to make sure our elders are included. We want to make sure that they're not suffering through this pandemic alone. And so that W is really important because, you with the O and the observe and empathize, you go where you think folks are not being served, but the widened perspectives may introduce a whole nother subgroup of people that need to be incorporated. Then the E is about experimentation. And so this is when you're prototyping, where you're trying new things. So this could be, and this is, I think it's really important for folks to think about when it's time to experiment, that you experiment in a way that's really cheap and fast and flexible. We're not talking about earmarking $100,000 to try something. No, we're talking about, it might be $10, it might be $20, right? Get some cardboard, some markers, and draw this thing. Get a piece of paper and do like a storyboard, like you would for a scene in a play or a movie, like, hey, we're going to storyboard this out. Maybe it's just organizing a pop-up with a few $100s and trying this thing out for a couple of days and seeing how people react. But you're experimenting, and ideally with multiple things, to see what shows promise, right? Sometimes, especially in schools, we think we've got to hire someone, spend a lot of money, and then go all in on implementation. And a year later, the results don't show out. They don't demonstrate what we hoped for. And we've already spent a lot of money and time. And that's a heck of a time to then say, okay, Principal Oliveira, we want to change this because now we're invested, right? That's why I say we experiment with something cheap and flexible and quick. If it works, great. Let's double down. Allow it. We can expand it. But if it doesn't, it didn't. No harm, no foul. There might be valuable lessons even in failure. And then the R is revision. It's like revisit, revise, reflect. It's like this, ongoing practice of examining what have we learned, what is working, what do we want to change. And what I think is important about power is that once we go through it, it's a cycle. It's a cyclical thing. We keep doing it. It's not a thing that you start and then you end, but hopefully it becomes a practice that changes the way you lead. Because I think when we lead with that orientation, when we use like a framework like power, then not only are we getting better and more connected to our community, but we're building more leaders in the process.
1,000%, 1,000%. Jonathan, the last question for us is, what lessons do you think people leaders in the corporate world can learn from leaders in education? And looking at it through the lens of the power framework, what is the one call to action you leave us with today so we can keep moving towards becoming the best people leaders we can be?
Yeah. Well, I think first of all, I would say, I love that question. And I think there's so much we as education leaders can learn from business, and I always talk about how in business, you can't take your clients for granted. You can't take your customers for granted because generally there's competition and they'll choose somebody else. In education, I think sometimes we forget that even though our kids are required to have an education, that we are still in a way competing. Maybe it's with TikTok. Maybe it's video games. Maybe it's with whatever's on YouTube. But I think we need to have that mindset of competition. We need to ensure that what we're providing to kids is as attractive and interesting and engaging. It centers their interests. But on the flip side, what do I think? I think one thing that business leaders could potentially learn from us is, schools, for good and for bad, are oftentimes the center of a whole community. It's the lifeblood, the heartbeat, like in many ways, decades and generations before, maybe it was a church or a synagogue. And today I feel like a lot of times it's a school. And so a school can be educating kids. It can be providing, language, second language instruction for families. It can be providing all sorts of connections and bridges to resources for families. And at our best as educators, we are operating with the sense that no kid is expendable. We have to find a way to connect every kid to this impossible future that they've envisioned for themselves, right? That they don't know how to get there, but we're going to help them get there. And so I think that's one way I think business leaders can learn from us, is that even as you're driving towards a bottom line, right? You may have shareholders or stakeholders, people who, a board, who you're answering to. There's also a double bottom line, or a triple bottom line, where what is the good that you can do, and what can your organization bring to the community that it's in, physically, literally, wherever your headquarters is, but also more broadly, wherever your trade area is. What is the good we can do when we look at our community as not expendable? Every single part of it is valuable. And what is it that we bring to the area, in terms of a lot of times a business, because of what it may offer, will attract people with immense talent that may or may not be inherent to that area. And so what does it look like to turn your workforce loose for community days, to bring value to your community, to invest, to volunteer, and to become woven into the fabric of a community? I think when we do that, it benefits us all, right? It would allow, I think, more business leaders to kind of leverage a power framework as well, right? To observe and empathize. How do the people who interact with us, how are they living their lives every day? I mean, if you want to be rich in this world, you figure out people's pain point and you address it. And how better to do that than to walk alongside people and see how they live every day. And so I think that's what I would invite, our business world, our business leaders to learn from us. I think as far as an action step, I think anybody who endeavors to be a leader, to challenge themselves to look at the people that they are leading as not just someone you get to boss around. And I know that's a very simplified way of saying it, but as really people who you're connected to, whose success is inextricably linked with your success, right? I've seen enough leaders in schools as well, where they're hoarding credit, right? They want to be seen as the savior, because they think that's what makes them look great. And what happens is when you do that, you stifle other leaders, and then the collective work is not as good. I think what we find is that when we support those that we serve, instead of thinking like we are in charge of or controlling, it makes us look better anyway. I look at leaders, when I see a school is operating at a high level, kids are safe, they feel happy, they love to be there, and the teachers are on fire. I'm like, man, this principal must be really good. She must be really good, right? That's my way of looking at it. And I think that's how, for all leaders out there, it's like, it's not just how do I move the people I lead to get the outcomes I want, but how do I invest in them in the same time? How do I help them be better versions of themselves so that they can also lead? It's a simple call, but it's the call I would say. I think we're in really interesting times in the United States and in the world, but this is my perspective. My sight line is on the U.S. We're in interesting times. And I think whether it's our politics, whether it's social media, there are so many forces that are making us or pushing us to distrust one another. And I think the more that we, stretch ourselves to trust one another, to believe in one another, to support one another, to like the way you did, you shared your platform with me today. You didn't have to do that. But the more that we do things like that, I think we all benefit. And that's the real way that if we're going to ever make America great again or our world great again, that's how we're really going to do it. Not apart, but together. So that's the call.
Jonathan, there is nothing simple about this call. It's very powerful. Thank you so much for sharing the power framework and sharing this amazing call to action with us. I really appreciate you. Thank you for being a guest.
Thank you for having me.
And that's a wrap, folks. If you want to reach out to share your thoughts, questions, you know where to find me. Miguel@leadershiptrailmix.com. Thank you for listening. Take care and talk soon.